Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, The Strategy of Risk, How Strategy Plays a Direct Role in Risk Realization. It's a pleasure to have all of you with us today. We have people joining from many different regions around the globe, so I appreciate that very much. Glad to have you. So a few reminders as we get started. The purpose of today's webinar, to share knowledge and trending on strategy's important link to risk. This is a topic that is not frequently discussed, but I think it's very important, hence the reason for today's webinar. If you have questions, please write your questions in the Q&A section. I, of course, will make it my goal to answer all questions at the close of the presentation. If for some reason we can't answer all questions, or I can't answer all questions, I'll follow up via email with you afterwards. This question always comes up, so I answer it early. The materials, yes, this entire webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive a link via email from us shortly. This link will also include the ability to view and download this presentation that you're going to see today in its own separate file. And also for those with the IBDC.D certification, you will receive 1 CPE credit by attending today. Just be sure to follow the proper CPE submission guidelines. All right, and with that, let's get started. I am your host today. My name is Mark Pfister. I am heavily focused in governance and strategy. I'm a non-executive director and a chief board consultant. I've worked with hundreds of boards. I've lost track of how many. It's well over 800 at this point. But it allows a lot of trending, having worked with that many boards and individual directors. My book, Across the Board, it's in 70 countries now. I welcome you to read it if you have not done so already. And of course, our program, the International Board Director Competency Designation. We've reached some really great milestones recently, 50 plus countries, and we just issued certification number 600 in December. So a lot of traction with the program. We're happy to see it. I'm going to share with you today. This is from one of my international speaking tours I've been doing for the last few years. I performed this same presentation for keynotes, as well as speaking sessions and conferences around the world. It's been a lot of fun talking about this. And I figured I would host a webinar on this same exact topic. So I took the topic areas, I've condensed them down to fit within our 45 to 50 minutes and then allow for some questions. So I hope you enjoy it, kind of an insight into some of the speaking that I do also. So I start with saying I am willing to take the risk. And this is something that we hear many people say quite often. This is said in their personal lives, in their professional lives. They are willing to take the risk. And we want to talk a little bit about what exactly this means and how strategy plays an integral role in this. So a few starting points here. I still laugh when I see some of these pictures, although some of them are a little bit scary. I am willing to take the risk and buy this house. Pay no attention to those boulders up on the hillside. This is a real picture, by the way. I am willing to take the risk and try this shortcut. Pay no attention to the low bridges. This picture is quite interesting for many reasons, not just what's written on the side of this trailer, but also on the back. It says our most valuable resource sits 63 feet ahead. I like to say that that's not the case anymore after this accident. I am willing to take the risk and proceed directly to production. This is a prime example of not looking at the prototypes that are done as part or including prototype into the strategy or the process for the making of clothing. So with all of this, there are a significant number of risks to consider, both again in our personal lives as well as our professional lives. Contract risk, commodity risk, country risk. We're looking at even things that we hadn't even thought about many years ago, such as pandemic risks and a lot of the strife we're seeing right now around the world. All of these things play into how do we get a hold of these risks that are out there? How do we start to think about these? How do we incorporate all these in our decisioning processes? And we start by first knowing that not all risk is bad, meaning that it's threats or negative risk areas. There are some areas of risk that are quite good, and we view those as opportunities, the positive risk areas. This is truly where the majority of innovation comes from in the companies that we know, both the large companies, the small companies, and many of the startup companies that we see today are truly playing off of this good risk area for the opportunities and leveraging the innovation and truly creating new industries and industry verticals from this idea that some risk is good. And this is kind of where strategy comes in and has to fit across these areas. If we look at this holistically, we know that with our opportunities in the positive risk area, our threats in the negative risk area, strategy needs to find a home that spans both of these areas. And it's very important to view these areas as parts of strategy. Many directors that I know will specifically cordon off the areas of risk into its own silo, and they'll think about strategy in its own silo. Personally, that's a big mistake to make because they are interrelated. They have direct inputs and outcomes on each other. We have to view them as integrated and truly inextricably linked. So we know that strategy can play a big role in risk. And I want to take you on a quick journey to explain some of the background. I truly believe that strategy is one of the most misunderstood areas or knowledge spaces that we think about as leaders today. Most leaders will claim they're great at strategy. I would disagree with that. I think most leaders need to truly dig further into and become more versed in strategy. And then I'm going to link into this history or the background of strategy, how risk plays a role. And I'm going to do those overlays for you to get a really clear understanding of this. So let's first start out with what we view today, or what is accepted today, as the current definition of strategy. It is defined as a careful plan or method, usually over a period of time, to achieve a specific goal. I will tell you that I do not subscribe to this definition anymore. I think it's very myopic. I think it's very monolithic in the way it's described. And I say this because a strategy is not always a careful plan or method. It's not always over a specific longer period of time, which is implied here. And it's rarely ever to achieve a specific goal, meaning that it's usually multiple goals. So as we go through today, I'm going to come back when we get to the end of today's presentation, and I want to try to expand and elaborate on what I view as the modern definition of strategy and how we should think about strategy as leaders with the responsibility of strategy and governance in our organizations, especially in the boardroom. So let me first take you down a high-level history of strategy and walk you back through a very interesting timeline that I think you'll find exciting. And I'm going to start us off with just this high-level view of strategy evolution, a couple of points in time of interest. 70 BC, we all know the story of the Roman poet Virgil. He tells the story of the Trojan horse where Greek forces entered the heavily guarded gates of Troy. Movies made about this, stories, everything we can imagine. 530 AD, King Arthur designs his famed round table so that no one, including him, would be seen above the others. Brilliant idea, brilliant strategy. And if we fast forward to more modern times, in 1993, a great point of strategic pinpoint in time was this book that was published by Michael Hammer and James Champy called Re-Engineering the Corporation. A really great book in talking about the hierarchy and the structures of organizations and how they should be looked at differently. Now, these three examples, totally random points in time, there actually is a little bit of a pattern to this here. And we look at, again, 70 BC, 530 AD, and 1993 AD, of course. And if we look at all of these, they kind of have a pattern to them in that one is related to an area of war, another one is related to an area of politics, and another one is related to an area of business. And this is not by chance. If we look back through the 2,500 plus years of modern strategy, or I should say current day strategy, we see strategy evolution truly only being honed in three areas across this whole time frame starting in 500 BC. So this is the practice of warmongering. So the approach of winning wars, or even more so important, avoiding wars. In the political realm, politicians gaining power and holding power. And in the business realm, business leaders creating monopolies and building power. This is truly, if we pinpoint down into the evolution areas of strategy, this is where strategy has made its biggest gains and where the majority of the evolution of strategy has happened. So it benefits mainly three professions over this period of time. Let's dig a little further into this. If we look at this in terms of the strategy phases, this is how they're classified. And there's this big bunching of time here between 500 BC and 1900. I'll elaborate a little bit further on that in a moment. But if we look at this holistically from end to end, in 500 BC through 1900, we look at the phases of war strategies and conflict deterrence and politics and exclusivity. Shouldn't be a surprise there to anyone. 1900 to 1968, we call this period the industrial proficiency. We then graduate into 1969 to the 1990s. We call these the strategy heydays. From the 1990s through the 2010s, or a portion of the 2010s, we call this the strategic proliferation. And what's quite interesting is that in the current period we're in now, the 2010s to the current year, we actually don't have a globally accepted name for the current phase of strategy that we're in. I have been calling this for the last 8 or 10 years or so, what I'm calling a morphic strategy, and I'll get into the reasoning for that naming convention in a moment. You can kind of guess by the name of morphic why I'm calling it that, but it's quite interesting to know that we are in this nascent area right now of a phase of strategy that we haven't quite all agreed on globally of a name to what phase we're in currently. Which can kind of tell you where we're taking this right now, that some of this is being created and implemented as we go, which is truly an easy thing to look back on as part of evolution. It's harder to actually be the trendsetter going forward. We'll talk a little bit about that. So let's look at a few of these phases. So again, we know that there's 2 phases within this period of time, 500 BC to 1900. One of those phases is called war strategies and conflict deterrence. And the best example of this goes back to, again, the 500 BC time frame, and Sun Tzu writes The Art of War. He was a philosopher, a military strategist, many different attributes to his name and what he was good at. And he talks about war strategies and conflict deterrence, but is more so focused on winning battles without fighting, saying that this is the best way to win. What's interesting about this, if you get a chance, this book is still relevant today. It's amazing to, when you're reading this book, that you're thinking that this was written back in 500 BC. It is worth a read. There are still today many strategies and tactical components of strategies that are based on this book, The Art of War by Sun Tzu. Now, in that same period of time, 500 BC to 1900, we also enter in the deep use of strategy in politics and exclusivity. And who better to reference as our featured person in this area than Machiavelli, known otherwise as the father of modern political science. Still to this day, his book, The Prince, which was published in 1532, it is still required reading in most political science courses. And he is quoted as saying, "It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both." Very interesting to look at some of his beliefs. The book is not easy reading, I will tell you. Some of it's quite scary, but you can see the correlations of this still to this day in everything from elections to some of the problems with democracy that we see today. So those are 2 quick points in time as they relate to that 500 BC to 1900. Then we get into some interesting areas of politics and exclusivity leading up to closer to the modern times of 1900. And John D. Rockefeller is a great example of this. The strategy during this time in the business realm was this belief that if you control everything, you have no competition. And of course, we know this works. This is where the monopolies were formed, and timeframes in which there really wasn't a good distribution of wealth, or even a middle class for that matter. So this exclusivity aspect of strategy was quite prevalent, but only a few at the top really benefited from this. Everybody else was sort of a pawn in the game. Few quick interesting tidbits of information on this. This strategy works so well, quite frankly, but not for everybody, but for a few. It works so well that we view John D. Rockefeller as the richest person in modern times with a current net worth, or I should say in current day value net worth of around $340 billion. But many people are not aware that he was not the richest person ever. And if we were in a live audience, as I do in my speaking engagements, I would ask the question, does anybody know who the richest person ever was, or at least that we know of? And the answer to that is a 14th century African king of the Mali Empire. His name was Mansa Musa, and he was worth well over $400 billion in today's value, almost immeasurable. We really have no idea to this day if it was even double or triple that. And just as a quick testament to this unbelievable amount of riches, on a trip, on a stop in Cairo, Egypt during his reign, he gave out so much gold that it temporarily generated a brief decline in gold's value. That's much, and I think he had 60,000 helpers with him along the way. Just totally unbelievable numbers. But again, coming back to this exclusivity side to this, we see this really in this leading up to 1900 period, really the 1800s to up to 1900, in John D. Rockefeller leveraging this exclusivity. Another quick note on this. Ida Tarbell came out with who was really one of the earliest examples of investigative journalism. She wrote an expose in 1904 called The History of the Standard Oil Company. And that really was, in the US at least, the starting point for the breakup of all these monopolies based on some of the practices that were exposed through Ida Tarbell's expose. Great history that's built into all of these examples of strategy. A lot of fun. Now, in 1900 to 1968, we move into a phase of strategy called industrial proficiency. And this was an area of focus for Peter Drucker, known also as the father of modern management. He was able to take this entire period and call the strategy of this, or classify the strategy as only a competition on price, or solely a competition on price. And yes, this truly was the way that companies and organizations competed, solely based on the price of their products and their services and their goods. But there was inherently a problem with this. And we saw this many years later with industries that never left this phase. And a great example of this is the US airline industry in the 80s. They never exited this industrial proficiency strategy component and stuck with this solely competition on price strategy, which drove the whole industry into the ground, and many bankruptcies in the 80s due to the fact that they were only competing on price, essentially over time, minimizing any type of profitability with no way out. That's really what moved that particular industry into the next phase we'll talk about in just a moment. 1969 to the 1990s moved us into something called, or the phase called the strategy heydays. And a great example of some of the writings that summarize this is through a book, What is Strategy, by Michael Porter. And he summarizes this period of the strategy heydays as looking at your business or your products and services as doing what everyone else is doing, but spending less money doing it, so lowering cost, but also adding in the component of do something that no one else can do. And this period of 1969 to the 1990s was truly benefited by the explosion of technology. Technology allowed for a massive amount of new products and services to be leveraged, hence the reason that this strategy heydays really leveraged the technology explosion and allowed for many companies to do something that no one else was able to do at those times. Now, the 1990s through the 2010s is quite an interesting time. I would tell you this is probably the low point of strategy across the full evolution, meaning that it became stagnant to a certain degree. I'll explain what I mean by that. But the premise of the strategic proliferation was that we were going to build on what we already do. We're also going to add something new, similar to the previous phase, but we're also going to be able to react opportunistically to emerging possibilities. This was also brought about by the emergence of new technologies, but the technology itself also allowed for the reaction to be quicker in the solutioning of many of these emerging possibilities. So it wasn't just the positive aspects of emerging possibilities, it was in many cases also the negative aspects of these emerging possibilities that were coming out that required solutions. However, so many theories and backgrounds and processes came during this period through multiple names and multiple aspects that we started to get into this time frame where these strategies piled up, and so did the complexity. And if we look back on the strategic proliferation phase between the 90s and into the 2010s, we see a massive amount of wasted money. We see theories behind certain strategies that were packaged up and proliferated through the internet that companies adopted that just weren't right for their organization or for their industry or for their company size or for their product focus areas or for their services. So the amount of strategy failures that were experienced during the 1990s through the 2010s was massive. We are still at the point in which we believe we're calculating what the losses were during this period of what many of these failures were chalked up to be governance failures. They were in reality strategy failures due to this proliferation, due to the mismatching of these theories of strategy or these packaged strategies being bought and implemented in these environments. Quite an interesting time. And there's a lot that went on in this phase above and beyond that. Another interesting book to read is called The Strategy Paradox by Michael Rayner. And also in this strategic proliferation phase, it's quite an interesting thing to read about, where he talks about being a leader with a compelling vision, applying bold leadership, and making decisive actions was not just the prerequisite for success. He also points out with proof that it also was the prerequisite for failure. So we could actually pinpoint that a leader that did, in some cases, exactly the same things in one industry, and they were successful. Another leader in another industry did exactly the same thing with the same approach, but that was their prerequisite for failure. And what's quite interesting about this is that he later goes on in this book to talk further about what he calls the strategy paradox. And he talks about this being a collision between the ability to make a commitment, or a leader being able to make choices, but those choices are based on assumptions about a future they cannot predict. That's where the uncertainty comes into. We are still at this point today where many leaders are stuck in these very tough decisions as it relates to strategy and as it relates to goals of the organization, in this collision between commitment and uncertainty. We can add in many other components in more recent years, such as the pandemic, that played this up even further. But quite an interesting read and a great background on strategy, and also a way of linking strategy to risk, which we're going to get more into shortly. Now, as I mentioned to you just a few moments ago, we don't really know what this next phase of strategy is called. There is no currently universally agreed name for this current phase of strategy. I mentioned that I started to name this amorphic strategy. I don't know if this name will stick or not. I do infuse it in all my speaking engagements because it helps me to describe in what I believe is very accurately what we think about, or what we should be thinking about in terms of strategy at this exact moment. So let's look at a few points of this. This amorphic strategy concept is truly the adaptability to quickly change. And why do we need to do that? Or what's forcing this? Or what things do we need to reference to actually be able to adapt to change quickly? So we talk about data and analytics, the big data components, technology advancements, disruption. Market trending is a big one right now around the globe. The financial markets currently, geopolitical influences, wars. Even generational motivations are quite interesting. We are in a time period currently where it is documented the most amount of formal generations working within the same companies. And some companies actually have 5 generations, starting with the greatest generation all the way up to Gen Z, I guess it is, all right, Gen Y currently. And we cannot rule out this amazing progress, even some announcements this week alone in machine learning and artificial intelligence. This truly is even more so driving this concept of amorphic strategy. And we have to think about this word of simultaneity as we were talking about this. Now, simultaneity is, from a governance viewpoint, or what I like to call governance simultaneity, is how do we possibly manage and oversee and make decisions that are worthwhile with all of these moving pieces and sliding scales? What do we do for these for these areas? How do we minimize our negative risk and maximize our positive risk? And that's really where the challenge comes in today of organizations and leaders, especially board directors and CEOs, making sure that they are on the cutting edge understanding aspect of how these pieces fit together and how to get the data to make the right decisioning. And another piece that's interesting to this is that amorphic strategy, or the concept of AI and machine learning now integrated into our current phase of strategy, is that we no longer need to apply strategy to only the big things we're focused on, or what could be considered the longer term goals we're looking to reach. Amorphic strategy, or strategy of today, is becoming commoditized. We can apply strategic components to some of the smallest aspects of a project with some of the software and the ability for this, the ability to look deeper into some of the more mundane areas or smaller tactical areas of projects or implementations that we're doing. So the amorphic component of this, again, is pointing out that we're not only applying strategy to the utmost top governance areas of control and maybe certain areas at the top areas of these strategies, but we're able to apply the formal concept of strategy to all levels of a project or an implementation. It's going to be quite interesting to watch how this evolves over the next decade or so. And we'll see if the name sticks. I don't know yet. So expanding on this a little bit further, I mentioned earlier that many leaders are not as versed as they should be in understanding how we should think about strategy. What is actually strategy in practice? How do we look at this from a leadership viewpoint throughout any level of our organization where we're leading others in the organization? So let me expand a little bit now above and beyond just the history of strategy and what those phases are. And hopefully there were a few aha moments as you hear this and saying it's not by chance in the history of strategy that we correlate strategies to war or to politics or battles. It's because that's where all of strategy evolved. It came from these areas. That's why we still use some of that same terminology today. But how do we apply this today? What is the practice? What does this look like in action? And I want to share with you a few very simple diagrams here that you may find helpful in how to understand this and how to apply this in your leadership and in your governance models. So honing this very simple view for 10 years, it's going to sound funny because it's such a simple diagram, but yes, it was about 10 years of trying to simplify this. And I'm a believer that if you can't simplify something in a visual view, a diagram on one page, you don't know it well enough. So it's kind of the drive behind this to make it as simple as possible. So how should we think about strategy? Strategy should very simply be thought of a double-edged arrow sitting between your goals and your tasks. Very simply. So next time you hear strategy, I want you to think of this very simple diagram, and I'll expand upon this. The principle of this is that you're creating a delineation between the objective and the action. Now, this is an area that some directors and some leaders have trouble with because they are creating the objective, but they're also getting involved in the action areas, or they're too involved in the action areas, which in many cases does not allow the organization to flourish or for others to take responsibility in their organizations. And this is where we come to the next phase of this, or the next level, I should say, of leadership. And typically, if I'm doing a CEO evaluation, I am looking to see if they truly understand where strategy fits in the larger scheme of things between goals and tasks, or we could say tasks and milestones. And in their normal day-to-day operations, are they truly thinking about the goals, the strategy, and the tasks in the overlay of the goals being the what and the why, the strategy simply being the how? Replace that word going forward of strategy with the word how, and the tasks or the milestones simply being the when and the who. If you're able to start to break down your environments into these particular chunks of focus as it relates to this overlay of the diagram of strategy, you're going to start to see that the leadership aspect of this becomes quite easy to understand and quite easy to keep control of as it relates to governance in your environments. So let's talk about the governance piece then. Another area that I'm laser focused on in the boards that I work with, that I consult, I want to make sure that they are able to shift gears, especially if it's a CEO of the organization. Again, they're coming from the leadership realm we just talked about a moment ago. Is that CEO able to shift gears when they enter the boardroom and go into the governance lens of strategy? Are the directors in the boardroom already able, whether they're non-executive directors or executive directors, are they able to view goals, strategy, and tasks in the right governance lens? And we do that very simply, and this is the full diagram right now you're looking at. Are they able to see goals in terms of their role as helping to set and ensuring the relevance of those goals? When they think about strategy, they know that the strategy is the how, but the majority of a director's focus after the goals are set for that period of time and ensuring the relevance is the validation of the approach, the validation of the how, which is the direct correlation of governance to strategy. This is what a board should be doing for the majority of its time once the goals are agreed upon in the organization. And the tasks, or as I like to say, the milestones, they should simply be viewed as a way of measuring progress. And I don't mean individual aspects of progress by individual tasks. I'm talking about rolled up tasks, typically called milestones, and that's your way of measuring the progress in the organization. Not stepping in at the governance level and going down and helping to solution those areas, but simply using the task delivery or the planned task delivery or the milestone roll-ups as a way of measuring progress against what you're responsible for as a senior leader in the governance realm, validating the approach, setting, ensuring the relevance of the goals, and measuring your progress of the delivery against that. Now, one other expansion on this concept, which I want to bring back now into the risk component area, is what I just mentioned, goals, strategy, tasks. We see the governance overlay here again. But now let's look at the risk consideration overlays of this. If you are a senior leader and you're trying to think of how do I visually look at and apply the governance components of strategy, and the areas I'm responsible also for strategy and governance combined, they're inextricably linked, remember. Typically, we can roll these up into the very simple consideration overlays of budget, scope, and time. I challenge everybody on this particular webinar at some point, whether it's now or 10 years from now, try to think of something that does not fit into in your professional realm, professional life, something that fits outside the components of budget, scope, and time. It's a nice, clean, and simple way of looking at everything around these particular parameters as it relates to governance and doing this as an overlay on the strategy components of your organization. Now, there's a little bit more. Let me make all of this real now and say, how do you apply this? So there's a little more to this holistic strategy picture. Let's bring all these concepts together. So I like to call this the Strategy Risk Governance Alliance. So we want to first start out with, this is something I write extensively about in my book, values of an organization equals the culture, which directly equals lower organization risk. Now you may say, how do you make those linkages? What do you mean by this? I want to first say that we should be viewing this very simple formula or statement, whatever we want to call it, as something that needs to be an integral part of any worthwhile strategy. Let me prove it to you. If we look at the importance of the ordering in an organization, you'll hear many leaders, and I would consider them immature leaders, they will talk about the mission or the vision of the organization first. I would tell you that's a mistake. We should be talking about the values of the organization first. Why? Because the values sit at the top of the chain. They sit at the top of this whole trickle down through the organization. I also like to say that the board owns this component in every organization they serve. The board is actually responsible even for choosing the proper CEO that understands that values take the top seat in this hierarchy. And the reason for this, again, is that the values, what do we stand for? What are the ethics, principles, and beliefs that we are going to align around to make sure our culture is correct? Now, the culture component is quite interesting if we look at this all together. If we start to look at strategy and governance in one area, values and culture and risk, how do we link this all together? How do we as leaders with responsibility of governance, how do we link all this? And this is a very simple way of looking at the overlays here. I'm going to first start out by saying that the corporate governance area here That is typically in the CEO's realm, the operational realm of the organization of ownership. And the outside ring that you see on this diagram to the right, the board governance, that is truly where the board is responsible. And you'll see they have direct touch points on strategy, governance, talent as it relates to the CEO, performance, and integrity. There's a whole bunch we could talk about in this diagram, but in today's discussion, I'm going to laser focus you on this center ring here. Any leader of an organization, if you boil down their responsibilities, the bullseye of their responsibilities is to truly manage risk. Don't view that as just negative. We already know that there's positive and negative risk, but they are overseeing risk or shepherding risk throughout the organization. But you'll see in this particular diagram that we don't go right from risk to strategy and governance and talent and performance or operations, reporting, and compliance. We have this other ring around here that talks about values and culture. And the reason for that is that, again, the values of an organization equal the culture, equal the level of risk of that environment. We all know and seen the case studies on organizations or see them in the news even as recently as this week. The organizations where the values were non-existent, management and leadership was not focused on it, the values they list are only on their website, there's no other way of them incorporating, or they haven't incorporated it in their day-to-day life of the organization. The culture suffered from that. There was eroding of the culture of the environments, which then leads to taking on additional risks through ethical breaches, taking shortcuts, things of this nature. I go back to that picture we looked at earlier of the truck wedged underneath the overpass. Start to think, if you're not already, start to think a little bit more about how the values and culture component are directly linked and touching that risk component that we as leaders are responsible for, especially in the governance realm. Now, if we look at a board decisioning flow, I want to spend just a moment on this because I felt it was nice to include this in here as an example of this. Let me give you a quick example of someone maybe at a management level. If I ask them the question of, or I make the statement, we're going to launch a new product. Now, if I ask that question of a manager or an employee level of the organization, I would highly suspect that they're actually going to give me an answer that is much more related to number 6 on this chart. Their entry point is going to be starting at number 6. Is this organization capable of delivering this product or this service? How do we integrate it? Those particular components. There's nothing wrong with that answer. That's at the level I would expect of an employee or a manager of an organization. If we look at this from someone who's responsible for governance, if we look at this, someone who's responsible for strategy and also of risk, I would expect a totally different entry point into the statement I just made for their conversation. So if I ask a leader, someone who's considered to be a senior leader, and I tell them what are their thoughts, or I ask them the question, what are their thoughts on the upcoming integration of this new product, or we bought a new company, we're going to integrate them into our environment. I would expect a much different entry point of discussion for that leader. I would expect them to start over to the left-hand side of the values. I would expect them to ask the question of, tell me a little bit about the culture of the organization that we're infusing and incorporating into our environments. And then I would expect them to match back to the vision. Does that organization fit with where we want to be or what we want to be or enable in the future? And how does that organization fit into, or that product or service, how does it fit into the current mission of our organization? Our mission being what we do well now. So you can see, and there's many examples of this. I can go through examples of companies that merged, where they looked at the organization delivery capability and not the values component first. Boeing, McDonnell Douglas is a great example. The other one I'm thinking of right now was AOL Time Warner is another example of this. The values of the organizations were mismatched, which means the cultures were mismatched, which meant it was never going to work from the beginning. For those of you in this webinar that are investors, next time you hear of a merger coming for an organization and you want to invest in that company, take a look first and foremost at the values of the organizations. Make sure they're a match, make sure they're focused on the same things. And I can be pretty sure in my statement to say that if you feel that the cultures of the environment of both environments are so far different, they're probably not company, or the merger and the company that comes out as the lead company is probably not something you want to invest into. It never works. Of course, the overlay across all of this is your budget, scope, and time components. Now, a great example of this in looking at the values of an organization, knowing how much they link back to risk of decision making, positive risk, negative risk. There's a great example here I commonly use. I write about this in my book also, and it's Roy E. Disney. Roy E. Disney was the son of Roy O. Disney, who was the co-founder with Walt Disney of course, Walt Disney. Now, if you ever want to see someone who came up with a brilliant idea and was a master at values-based decisioning, it was Roy E. Disney. When he took over the company many years later, he decided to test something. And he wanted to say, if I had to make decisions this entire week for everything that crosses my desk that requires an immediate decision, how do I make faster decisions? And how do I make sure that they're the right decisions? And he did something very interesting. He printed out the values of the organization. That was the only thing on his desk. And he said to himself, for everything that comes into my door or across my desk this week, I'm going to make the decision based on a comparison to which values or value it supports in the organization. Now, that's not to say he didn't go back later and look at data and have input and have his teams supply him with additional data which either support or negate his decision. But he was quite amazed to find out that every decision he made that week, some of them quite important decisions, were the right ones. Even after he got the data following, days later, he said to himself that this is a great way to think about how to make decisions in an organization, how to lower risk in the organization by at least starting the process with a comparison to the values, which is the culture first, and then moving that into the data components to make to support any type of decision or change your mind in the decision you're going to make. Quite an interesting and brilliant way of looking at this. It's had quite an effect in my life, in my professional life, on looking at this and making the values of the organization not just something that's listed on a website, but also make sure that the values match to the culture, which match back to the boardroom as it relates to strategy and governance components, and specifically risk. So I mentioned earlier, and I think I'm still on time. Let's just do a quick time check. I am on time. The old definition I read to you earlier of strategy, a careful plan or method, usually over a period of time to achieve a specific goal. You already know I don't subscribe to this anymore. I think it's outdated. Oops, sorry, wrong way. So what is this modern definition that I'm talking about? I view this very differently. I say that strategy is a set of guiding principles when communicated and adopted, generates a desired pattern of integrated decision-making. We need to move our mindset away from strategy being only in these hard, tangible deliverables, a plan, dates in which to deliver something by. We need to move that more so into the aspect of making decisions. And by doing that, we lower risk. So think about this differently. Think about this integrated decision making when you say about strategy. And there's going to be probably some interesting questions that come up as we go along here on what exactly does this mean, and I'll answer those to the best of my ability. But if there's one thing that you take away from today's discussion, remember this strategy being a pattern of integrated decision making, and it allows for a few things, not just the theory behind how to go about thinking about strategy, but also not viewing strategy as a one and done, meaning you come up with your strategy and it goes and sits on a shelf somewhere. Strategy now is evolving. It's amorphic, as I mentioned earlier. We have to keep revisiting strategy. We have to keep validating the goals and making sure that these are a fit as we go along, even much shorter timeframes. The 2 and 4 year strategies today, companies still create them. I'm not against that, but I do believe, and it's the responsibility of a board on a quarterly basis to do a quick overview to make sure that the goals of the organization are still relevant and the strategy is still valid for what they're looking to accomplish with the overlays of budget, scope, and time. So With strategy, this is why I'm willing to take certain risks, whether they're negative risks or positive risks. I want to know the level of these risks. We can do that by thinking about the linkages of strategy to risk. And I ask you the question, are you also willing to take the risk? We'll jump to a few Q&A session in just a moment here. Let me first mention that much of the concepts, we scratched the surface on this today. If you're interested in learning much more about this, how you apply it in the C-level or the boardroom, our program, Becoming an Exceptional Board Director Candidate, you earn your International Board Director Competency Designation. You have multiple ways of registering for this course in the one-on-one, the group, or the on-demand. It overlays both the strategy and governance components we just mentioned. It's not just board director, modern day board operations, it's also the proper way to package yourself for global boards, not just regional or country boards. All right, quick summary, and then we'll go to questions. Remember, you want to fully understand the interrelationship between strategy and risk for the reasons I mentioned. You want to make sure that you remember that there are both positive and negative risks, and start to link more in your mindset the positive risks to the innovation areas of your decisioning and of your organization. And never forget to do the overlay of the values and the culture components across all of these areas. Let's move to a few questions. How can I ensure strategy is being properly understood and applied in my organization? It's a good question. It's probably the biggest challenge for most leaders. And I always think about really three parts to this answer. First, I truly think it's worthwhile to make sure everyone in the organization at every level understands exactly what strategy is. We talked about this today. How do we think about strategy in the grand scheme of things? If you knew the number of people that think that goals and strategy are the same thing, or they describe them in the same way, you'd probably be amazed. It's sickening. They are such different areas, but many people believe them to be the same. So first, knowing what strategy is. Second, is there a need, or I should say, elaborating upon that, is there actually a need for furthering the education of strategy in the organization? Do your leaders understand this? I can tell you that one of the earliest, and I'll share this question with you right now, there's no harm in doing this. When I do my CEO interviews and my board director interviews, when I'm working for nominating committees of different organizations, I will always ask in the first 10 minutes of these interviews the following question. And by the way, if they get this question wrong, these interviews do not last past 10 minutes, because I already know there's a fundamental misunderstanding or no understanding of what their role is going to be when they enter the boardroom. It's the following question. Tell me about your understanding of the interrelationship between strategy and governance. Tell me about your understanding of the interrelationship between strategy and governance. Now, everybody on this webinar already understands what that answer should be. It's the overlay of the diagram that I shared with you just a moment ago. I want to know that you understand that the goal setting relates back to the what and the why. I want you to tell me that the strategy relates to the how. I want you to tell me that the milestones relate to the when and the who. From the governance lens, I want you to talk about the fact that the goals are truly being looked at as a way of understanding where, not just where the organization's going, but are we able to ensure the relevance of those goals from a governance lens? From a strategy standpoint, are we able to validate the strategy that it supports the goals correctly? And of course, measuring progress through the tasks and milestones, not jumping in to do the solutioning. These are very easy ways, I would say, as a leader, to make sure that those in your environment and your organization understand truly what strategy is. Over the years, the number of so-called strategic planning sessions I've been called into that wound up being goal-setting meetings, I lost count. I'm to the point now where if someone invites me to a strategic planning session, I ask them to send me the goals at least a week in advance so I can be prepared to talk about strategy. Don't fall into the rabbit hole of the person telling you we're going to cover or touch on the goals also during our strategic planning session. They are two different things. They require different focus. They require different mindsets at those times. I highly recommend not combining those into one. All right, another question here. If you have a company that has multiple business units in varying industries, can one set of guiding principles work for all business units? Now, let me be clear that I understand this question properly. If you're talking about guiding principles being the values, then I would tell you absolutely. And I also believe that a properly formulated culture, or the values leading to the culture, don't need to be different based on the products you make, the services you provide, what business unit you work for, what line of business you work for. I would even say that it shouldn't vary in one company across different regions around the globe. If your values are correct and the culture you're looking to build is one that is valid for the organization, it is independent, I would say, of the geography, and it's independent of the business units or the lines of business. I hope that's helpful. All right, let's look at another question here. Your proposed modern definition of strategy seems to be more of a process than a definition. Am I understanding this properly? Absolutely. Absolutely. And as I'm mentioning earlier, and I don't mind elaborating on this a little bit as we're talking right now. First, let me commend the thought process on this, because the fact you're asking the question is opening up your mindset right now to the fact that we want to view this more as a process. So again, as it relates to governance at any level of an organization, we need to think of strategy more as an iterative process. If we understand that the process of strategy fits into this iterative process, we know that we're viewing it more as the importance is the discussion which leads to the elevated outcome. I hope I'm saying that correctly. So think about this going back to that definition, that the strategy, if you're a senior leader, the process of the strategy and the governance of the strategy for you is actually more important than the strategy itself. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but that is truly what your role is there to do. In most cases, the organization or the leadership of the organization outside the board is responsible for the creation of the strategy or the proposal of the strategy. From a board director's lens, yes, they need to fully understand the strategy and the theory of strategy overall, but they are there to ask questions about that strategy. The questioning and the understanding of the strategy and understanding the background of that strategy, that to me is truly the governance overlay that we just discussed a moment ago. Hope that's helpful. Okay. I feel like the majority of the strategic planning sessions I attend are actually goal-setting meetings. Is this your experience as well? This question came in earlier, so I was talking about this a moment ago. That used to be the case for me, and I will tell you that it's still prevalent throughout most organizations. Be the leader now that says to someone who invites you to a strategic planning session, be the leader that does what I mentioned a moment ago. Ask them to send you the agreed upon goals, and you'll be glad to attend their strategy session. If they send you the goals, which are the what and the why, you'll gladly join and add value to a meeting where the strategy is discussing the how. The problem again with this is that if you're attending the meeting to talk about the goals and you're going to rush into the strategy afterwards, is the how truly going to be worthwhile if the what and the why are not accurate or not fit for the organization? Be the leader that separates those two meetings. You'll do yourself a great favor. All right, other questions here. Yeah, so a follow-up to the earlier question. So in one set of guiding principles, you must have the ability to derive differing strategies from the one set of principles. So the principles must be broad enough. Absolutely. I will, my comment to this aspect of a mission and a vision of an organization actually being a little bit broader rather than necked and narrowed down into a certain area can be quite valuable. That also goes for the values of the organization. You want to allow a little bit of openness in these descriptions and these definitions for yourself and your organization to allow for some autonomy. You want folks in the organization to take ownership and drive things to conclusion and be successful and feel like they were part of the solution. You do that by not narrowing the vision and the mission of the organization. And you also do that by being a little bit broader with the values, but also not so broad where you cannot commend or reprimand somebody for the values of the organization. One of the easiest ways for a leader to truly make an impact, and if we go back to Roy E. Disney's concept of values-based decisioning, think about this next time someone in your organization does something great or does something terrible or bad. When you commend them for living one of the values of the organization, not necessarily for what they accomplished. If you have to reprimand someone in your organization, reprimand them privately based on the value or multiple values they breached of the organization. And by the way, if somebody in the organization did something wrong and you're not able to match it back, wrong or right, and you cannot match it back to a listed value of the organization, that in itself is a problem. It says that your values are not relevant for your organization, which likely means that you've undermined your culture in some way. Try this out. It's along very similar lines to what I mentioned about values-based decisioning for senior leaders. Try it out also with commending and reprimanding someone in your organization. All right. Another question here. They say, I too have read Michael Rayner's book, The Strategy Paradox. Do you feel that risk is becoming synonymous with strategy? Great question. You know, I've been using this word more so often. I hope it's not too cheesy, but I like to think that we're getting into the realm now where risk and strategy are truly synonymous, but we're reaching, here comes my cheesy word, we're reaching this point of singularity as it relates back to those two areas. I actually believe that all strategies need to incorporate some level of risk, meaning positive or negative, or at least touch on the levels of risk of what they're looking to accomplish. And we have to look at the interrelationship of strategy and risk truly being dependent on one another. We can't, let me clarify this. We can't build out a strategy without taking risk into consideration and thinking that the strategy is robust enough. We also can't look at risks across an organization, positive or negative, without applying a strategy or a how to them to make sure that we are able to understand if and when they are actually being realized. How do we do that earlier rather than more reactive? Once we know it's there, we have to react to it. So how do we proactively see if that's happening or the trending is pointing that way? That's all coming back to components of strategy to say, this is how we're going to measure this. This is how we're going to react. And this is how we're going to govern the reaction and the ongoing management or the ongoing oversight of these particular areas. Everything I just described is truly a strategy. You have to talk about the planning and how you're going to approach this and how then you're going to measure it and police those particular aspects. So there are definitely different levels of strategy. I mean, we don't have to necessarily say that all strategies are complex. They don't have to be. There are some very simple strategies that are 3 or 4 lines, and they relate to one specific area of oversight as it relates to governance. But in closing of today's lecture, be the leader that is viewing these extremely important links of strategy, governance, and risk. We cannot view these in a siloed manner anymore. It's not possible. And the leaders that are not understanding of what I'm calling, again, this phase of amorphic strategy we're moving into, the leaders that don't understand these interrelationships, nor want to put any time, nor care potentially about the interrelationships of strategy, governance, and risk, those leaders will be buried. There'll be failures in what they're doing because it's impossible to separate those 3 areas and look at them in a siloed manner. It's impossible to do today and be successful. I thank everybody for joining today. I hope it was helpful. It's one of my fun topics to talk about, and reach out, connect with me on LinkedIn or send me an email with your thoughts or experiences on this. I thank you very much and I wish you a great day. Bye now.